Salutations. In the 2020s, we live in a very polarizing and confusing era politically. Camps are divided into left and right. This is, generally speaking, how both parties more or less think, or partisans of both parties think. The Republicans on the so-called right favor limited government, states' rights, a border wall, reduced spending, which is austerity, deregulation of industries, low taxes, and Judeo-Christian values. They are anti-abortion, pro-gun, anti-tax, embrace hostility towards China, and have an antagonistic stance towards the Federal Reserve and believe in the theory of supply-side economics, and are antagonistic towards anything that they perceive to be as communism, and claim to support founding principles and claim that the history of the United States of America is without flaw. The Democrats on the so-called left, in theory, support big government, but still very limited in its scope of what it does to address structural problems, push diversity and inclusion as a way to feign social progress, are opposed to a border wall, favor basic income and welfare. They are pro-abortion, anti-gun, pro-tax, so they can give our taxes to private companies. They don't think much of the Federal Reserve, don't think much of supply-side economics so long as diversity is promoted. Claim to support democratic socialism when they don't even understand what Marxist economic theory really is or entails, and are antagonistic towards Russia and reject the historical progress of the United States of America with a complete disassociation from the past. In the midst of all of this, what liberals don't seem to understand, nor do conservatives fully understand, that outwardly the Democratic Party and the Republican Party appear to be starkly different. But internally, they are both the same as neoconservatives, or the Bush gang, as I term it, having embedded themselves within both parties as a means to advance their agenda, pitting both liberals and conservatives against each other, while liberals and conservatives structurally support the same thing. This impasse must shift as social and economic conditions continue to deteriorate and the U.S. continues to slump into decline. In order to move forward, we must re-examine what conservatism versus liberalism meant in the classical sense of the debate and go back to the beginning of the foundation of our republic, when liberal versus conservative had very different meanings compared to what they mean now. This is what I call the John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson debate. Conservatism in the post-revolution era of the Republic meant that one supported proactive centralized government, otherwise known as federalism. Federalists supported concentrated power of the federal government. They distrusted tyranny of the mob, extreme democracy, believed in the power of the executive. They were in favor of imposing taxes and protective tariffs to raise revenues for infrastructural projects. They supported the concept of standing armies controlled by the federal state. Federalists supported a national bank with a currency pegged to gold, and while not opposed to the concept of westward expansion, were lukewarm to the idea of rapid western expansion. Federalists also supported a vision of the United States of America that was rooted within industry and manufacturing and banking, and the dominance of the city over the farm, and antagonistic towards slave labor. Federalism was favored by the northern half of the original 13 states. This was the position of John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. The liberals, aka the Democrats, were the antithesis of federalism. The liberals were in favor of limiting the power of the federal government. They supported states' rights, were in favor of low taxes, no tariffs, free trade, differed to popular consensus through democracy, feared the power of the executive. They wanted decentralized banking with currency backed by silver, and were opposed to standing armies and supported decentralized militias. This was a vision of the United States of America that more or less relates to agrarianism, farming upheld by slave labor, and took an aggressive position expanding westward for the sake of developing more agricultural-based economies facilitated by slave labor. This vision was predominant in the southern half of the 13 states and was the position of Thomas Jefferson and later Andrew Jackson. These two contradictory visions, which formed the United States, would come to a head-on clash in the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. And the Federalists, aka Lincoln, won the war against the insurgent Confederacy, bankrolled by the British Empire. From the Civil War, with exception to the presidencies of Grover Cleveland, a principled limited government Jeffersonian Democrat from the North, mind you, and Woodrow Wilson, a Southern Democrat who had sympathies towards the insurgent Confederacy, Republicans who were Federalists would dominate the presidency until Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency. And as stated in a previous video, FDR switched parties after the GOP backed the more business-friendly Taft wing of the Republican Party and distanced itself from the progressive Roosevelt wing of the Republican Party during the 1912 election. In response to the progressive and racially inclusive Roosevelt Republicans becoming Democrats, Southern Jeffersonian liberals think Strom Thurmond and later Ronald Reagan would enter the Republican Party and redefine the term conservative, with an overemphasis on Thomas Jefferson, but with little to no emphasis on John Adams or the Federalist Party, and consider federalism to be left-wing communism. Thus, neoconservatism, which is in actuality liberalism, was born and became the standard operational procedure of the Republican Party from more or less, give or take, 1981 up until the present time. Neocons support limited government, except when it comes to bailouts of the financial sector. Aggressive foreign policy, especially towards socialist countries like Cuba, which do not want to open their borders to be exploited by London and Wall Street. Low taxes, public austerity, police state, low-wage, high-profit, corporate-driven economy. They are antagonistic towards labor unions, indifferent towards civilian strife relative to economic inequities, believe in the rule of the free market, no tariffs, free trade, the dissolution of borders, gun control to disarm the working class, deindustrialization, and are friendly with the CIA manipulation of the citizenry at home, our own citizenry at home, and sabotage of nations abroad to protect the profits of London and Wall Street, and are effectively the establishment of both Democratic and Republican parties today, with only cosmetic differences between the two parties as it relates to social issues. This was standard operational procedure until the Trump anomaly presented itself, posing outward hostility toward the neoconservative Democratic Party and the neoconservative Republican Party establishment, while giving minor concessions to Republican neocons. And here we now have a political realignment starting to formulate. However, there are growing pains. Due to 40 years of neoconservative propaganda advanced by the Heritage Foundation and Prager University, which is liberalism in the classical sense of the term, conservatives consider proactive federal power, which ironically they are begging for to break up big tech and BlackRock land acquisitions, to be on par with tyranny and left-wing communism, when federalism, in terms of the foundation of our republic, is the true conservative position. We live in an era where Mitch McConnell who is the ideological successor to Jacksonian Democrat Strom Thurmond, is considered by Trump supporters to be a communist. That's like saying that Mao Zedong was a liberal who supported free trade, open borders, and free market capitalism, which Mitch McConnell does support, when he was exactly the opposite of that. That's why we are where we are today. 40 years of bipartisan neoconservatism, which is liberalism, has got us into this mess that we are in today. Limited government yielding to the anarchy of an unregulated market has allowed for the cost of living to skyrocket via overvaluation of real estate, driving our citizenry into poverty because they can't afford to live anywhere. It has allowed for Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos to consolidate wealth and power that rivals the robber barons of the Gilded Age of the late 19th century. Corporations directly influence our political policies, which undermine working-class Americans every day and which deliberately misinform our citizenry to support their profit motives. We do not live in a democracy. We live in a kleptocracy. I am standing in Zuccotti Park, birthplace of Occupy Wall Street. 99% versus 1%. We live in a kleptocracy. Our commons are being sold off to the highest bidder instead of preserved from market exploitation. Our public infrastructure is left to rot while bureaucrats take payoffs and sell off our infrastructure to the highest bidder to profit from. Our public institutions are being deliberately eroded. Our communities are being destroyed economically and socially through mass shootings and drug addiction and despair, and through nonprofit organization-backed protests meant to bully the 99% into supporting more economic liberalism. We are very close to seeing the destruction of our republic if something doesn't change. At this time, the Republican Party is in a time of transition. The way forward is to look to the past, and for the Republican Party to embrace neo-federalism and look to the example of Theodore Roosevelt's presidency as a model. This limited government philosophy embraced by neocons and Democrats needs to end. We need a proactive federal government that breaks up and regulates tech monopolies, imposes price controls on real estate developers and speculators to protect our citizenry from being priced out of their homes. Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos need to be put into federal prison for using their wealth to influence COVID policies, which allowed for them to engage in crisis profiteering. Strict civil service reforms need to be imposed as a means to crack down on bureaucratic corruption. The CIA needs to be disbanded outright. The FBI needs to be dramatically reformed, if not eliminated. The Federal Reserve needs to be seized and put under the direct control of the American state and not under the control of international banking cartels with no allegiance to our republic. Our currency needs to be pegged to a hybrid of gold and silver and taken off the petrodollar. Offshore banking either requires a heavy remittance tax or to be rendered illegal outright, so capital is not siphoned out of our republic. The United States military needs to uphold their oath of protecting this country against enemies, foreign and domestic, which means Bush, Obama, Clinton, Pelosi, McConnell, Cheney, and anyone associated with them goes straight to federal prison for harming our country. We need to reindustrialize so that every citizen may be productive tax-paying citizens. We need to develop nuclear fusion reactors to power our cities and reduce our dependence on oil. We need to get off our diplomatic and economic ties with the British Commonwealth, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, impose heavy sanctions on them for being leeches upon our republic, and establish diplomatic and economic ties with Russia, China, and Iran instead. In addition to these structural reforms, we embrace both tradition and progress. There needs to be a constitutional amendment passed which bars abortion after 10 weeks, but in addition to that, also entitles struggling single mothers to economic aid until the child reaches 4. A border wall goes up, but red tape around immigration gets cut to make it easier for prospective citizens to become naturalized. Symbols of the Republic, not the Confederacy, the Republic, will remain intact, but New statues which illustrate historical progress will also be erected. Thomas Paine, Malcolm X, Leslie Feinberg, Clara Limlich, they all deserve statues for being champions of the working class. Lands taken from indigenous tribes and African Americans will be redistributed to them after the state seizes those lands from Bill Gates and puts him in prison. The Second Amendment will not be touched, and all public schools will have gun safety instruction and survival skill instruction, as well as given to them by a trained veteran. Children under 12 in a public school setting will not be exposed to either Christian fundamentalism, woke fundamentalism, or genderqueer theory. Let the kids be kids and leave the adult stuff out of it. The FDA will be re-empowered to crack down on Big Pharma. A centralized healthcare system will be established and paid for via tariffs on imported goods and international tourism to the United States. There will be equilibrium established between individual freedom and common good. In closing, to any Republican who watches this, I implore you to re-examine what it means to be a conservative and what it means to be a liberal. What you currently support is liberalism, but you think it's conservatism, even though the neocons will tell you to blame socialism for the very problems that liberal anti-government policies have caused, which you still support anyway. Proactive government is not about controlling your life. It's about improving the quality of your life so Bill Gates and the 1% do not establish a dictatorship over your existence. To any Democrat who watches this, swallow the purple pill. Move into the center and meet halfway with the MAGA crowd. They're not as bad as you think. The rank and file of the GOP, including military and law enforcement, has turned against the FBI, the CIA, NATO, and George W. Bush, while the Democratic Party establishment in 2022 embraces them. This is not something to condemn. This is something to applaud as far as the Republicans are concerned. This is something to applaud, and you encourage them to keep going forward. If not, outright join them. You don't have to agree with them all the time. I don't. Making America great again is not solely about Donald Trump. It's about taking our country back from the neoconservatism that has poisoned this republic and getting our country back on track relative to its tradition of historical progress. But we need some neo-federalist policies to make that happen. And let's make it happen. That is all I gotta say. God save our American state. This is Comrade Pella, signing out.